A single jawline, sharpened by centuries of forbidden unions, became the silent executioner of a dynasty once destined to rule the known world. In this documentary, we unravel the true story of the Habsburgs, a medieval family that sought power so obsessively that they chained their own bloodline to secrecy, sin, and genetic collapse. You will witness how one ruling house used marriage as a weapon, and how that weapon eventually turned against them. We travel to the late medieval courts of Central Europe, a world bound by superstition, fragile alliances, and a ruthless hunger for control. Kings did not trust neighbors. Nobles feared betrayal from within. In this world of shifting borders and contested crowns, the Habsburgs forged a simple rule: only blood can protect blood. But soon, that rule twisted into something far darker. The earliest Habsburg lords believed that external alliances were dangerous. Foreign brides brought foreign loyalties, and foreign sons could betray dynastic ambitions. Thus emerged a quiet tradition: cousins marrying cousins, uncles marrying nieces, blood folding back upon itself like a sealed vault. At first, the result seemed miraculous. Lands expanded, influence deepened. By the early 15th century, the Habsburgs were heirs to vast territories stretching across Central Europe. But with every union, genetic diversity narrowed. And within the stone chambers of their castles, whispers began about children born frail, twisted, or silent. Still, ambition outweighed caution. The family moved forward, unaware that they were building a structure destined to collapse from the inside. The Habsburgs perfected a marriage strategy that shocked even their contemporaries. While other noble houses sought alliances across the continent, the Habsburgs looked inward. The motive was simple: consolidate power without risk. The method was chilling: keep royal blood undiluted by ensuring that almost every union occurred between close relatives. Chroniclers of the time described children born with strange jaw deformities, breathing issues, and faces that grew progressively elongated. Yet the dynasty viewed these signs not as warnings, but as symbols of purity, a belief that would bind them to tragedy. Every match was calculated, every birth was a political move, and every death was dismissed as a natural price of control. By the 15th century, a new and unmistakable mark appeared within the family: a warped lower jaw that jutted forward, making eating and speaking increasingly difficult. It became known as the Habsburg jaw. While today it is recognized as a genetic deformity linked to repeated inbreeding, medieval observers treated it almost as a divine omen, a signature sculpted by God upon a chosen lineage. But behind the myth lay a far harsher truth. Some heirs struggled to chew, others drooled uncontrollably. One prince was said to choke frequently during meals. Yet these struggles remained hidden behind tapestries and etiquette, concealed from all but the closest attendants. As the jaw grew more pronounced through successive generations, so too did the dynasty's dependence on the very practices causing the deformity. Life inside the Habsburg palaces was governed by unspoken fear. Every child was observed, measured, evaluated. Physicians recorded tiny deviations: a slight speech delay, a hesitant step, all interpreted as signs of inherited weakness. Mothers carried silent guilt. Fathers felt the pressure to produce an heir who looked strong enough to command legions. Behind closed doors, noble relatives whispered prayers that their newborns would not inherit the heavy jaw or the trembling limbs of their predecessors. But the court demanded silence. Nobody questioned the marriage laws. Nobody suggested breaking the bloodline circle. To speak against tradition meant to betray the dynasty itself. Thus, generation after generation, the psychological pressure grew, echoing through ceremonial halls like a ghostly weight none could escape. The Habsburg strategy tightened in the late medieval period. Every marriage was an act of conquest. A niece could become a queen. A cousin could become the diplomatic glue between two empires. Marriage negotiations lasted years, with theologians, advisors, and genealogists calculating risks as though planning a military campaign. Yet while the political rewards were immense, the human cost surfaced quietly. An unusual number of stillbirths, infants unable to feed, heirs dying before reaching adulthood. Chroniclers recorded these tragedies with polite euphemisms: weakness of body, unfavorable heir, melancholic temperament. But in truth, the dynasty had begun consuming itself. In medieval Europe, physical deformities were often interpreted as heavenly judgment. Rumors crawled through taverns and markets. The Habsburgs suffer because they broke God's laws. These whispers terrified the dynasty. They intensified religious rituals, commissioned masses, built chapels, and surrounded themselves with confessors. Yet nothing changed. Each decade produced heirs with increasingly pronounced features. Even within the court, some wondered whether their power, built through careful manipulation of blood, had become their curse. Still, the family pressed forward. The world saw only crowns and victories. Few understood the dread carried within the private chambers of their castles. By the end of the medieval era, the Habsburgs were poised to dominate Europe. Their territories stretched like a vast spine across the continent. But behind this triumph lay a fragile reality. Every new heir symbolized both hope and potential catastrophe. Some children appeared strong only to weaken with age. Others carried the unmistakable marks of genetic damage from the moment they opened their eyes. As the family prepared to enter the early modern period, the seeds of collapse were already sown. The dynasty had won its empire, but it had also forged the instrument of its destruction, locked within its own blood. As the dynasties stepped into the early modern world, their medieval traditions continued unchanged. The practice of marrying within the family was no longer a quiet habit. It had become a core political doctrine. Yet the consequences, once subtle, now became impossible to hide. Generations of restricted marriages had tightened the genetic circle to a breaking point. Children were born with brittle health, fragile bone structures, and the telltale jaw that had grown so extreme it seemed almost sculptural. Still, the family believed destiny guided them. Their rise across Europe appeared proof that God favored their blood. But destiny has limits, and blood has memory. Foreign ambassadors who visited Habsburg courts often described an unsettling contrast. The palaces were immense, the rituals grand, the ceremonies meticulously choreographed. But the young heirs who appeared during formal receptions moved stiffly, spoke with difficulty, or seemed unusually frail. One chronicler from the late 16th century noted that a Habsburg prince struggled to close his mouth as though his bones defied him. And yet, the dynasty concealed these weaknesses beneath layers of etiquette. Servants were trained to stand close, ready to intervene. Tutors tailored lessons around physical limitations. Physicians developed entire routines for managing eating, sleeping, and breathing disorders. Power endured, but it rested on bodies not built for endurance. Perhaps the most infamous union occurred in the late 16th century when a Habsburg uncle married his own niece, a decision justified through politics, inheritance, and the need to protect dynastic purity. This marriage produced an heir whose life would later symbolize the final collapse of the bloodline. The boy was born weak, with a jaw so pronounced he could barely chew. Court physicians documented his chronic illnesses, his delayed development, and his isolation from other children. His very existence became a painful secret, proof that the family's ancient marriage practices had crossed into irreversible harm. But he was the only male heir, and the dynasty, trapped by its own customs, proclaimed him the future of their empire. That child would grow into the last Habsburg king of Spain, a monarch doomed long before he wore the crown. From infancy, he battled sickness. His jaw was so extended that eating required special techniques devised by royal attendants. His speech came slowly, his movements were labored, and his learning was hindered by repeated fevers and neurological strain. Behind palace walls, his caretakers prayed he would survive each winter. Outside the walls, diplomats speculated openly about his frailty. Yet the dynasty insisted he would lead. They dressed him in heavy ceremonial robes, placed him in public spectacles, and portrayed him as a symbol of continuity. But to those closest to him, he was a reminder of every forbidden marriage, every decision made centuries earlier. As Charles reached adulthood, his health deteriorated. Witnesses described him as skeletal, with limbs that moved awkwardly and joints that cracked audibly when he walked. He suffered seizures. He experienced difficulty digesting food. At times, he lost the energy to stand, forcing attendants to carry him during state processions. Yet the weight he bore was not merely physical. It was the weight of a dynasty's hopes, a burden no human body could withstand. Diplomats recorded their observations with quiet shock. One wrote that the king trembled like a candle near its end. And still, the Habsburgs clung to the belief that their bloodline was sacred, even as it was collapsing before their eyes. Charles never produced an heir. His marriages were attempts to secure the future, but his health made fatherhood nearly impossible. With each passing year, the truth became painfully clear. The bloodline had reached its limit. The centuries-long experiment of dynastic purity, born in medieval ambition and preserved through fear, had destroyed itself. When Charles died in the late 17th century, physicians described his body as a map of inherited suffering, bone deformities, organ failure, signs of severe malnutrition despite constant care. He was not merely one man. He was the final echo of a medieval strategy that had turned inward until nothing remained. The story of the Habsburgs is not simply a tale of power or decline. It is a portrait of how fear, the fear of losing land, titles, and control, can shape decisions across centuries. Their dynasty rose through calculation, ambition, and ruthless protection of blood. But that same strategy carved their downfall, generation by generation, face by face, until their legacy became a caution written into their very bones. History reminds us that no empire collapses in a single moment. Often, the seeds are planted quietly, in choices repeated over time, long before anyone recognizes the consequences. And so the Habsburgs stand as a warning. What we build through fear may one day be undone by that same fear, carried silently within us.